Hi everybody, it's Miss Elka again. I forgot to tell you last time that I'm doing these from my daughter's closet. She has a cute little fort in here, so that's all the little glowy things behind me, and there's all sorts of little girls' closet fort things like hedgehogs and humongous koalas and llamas and all sorts of things. So yeah, basically I'm hiding in a closet reading to you guys because that's what it's come to around here. But let's get back to these nasty twits because it's getting ready to be on like Donkey Kong with these crazy people. The frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back, climbed into her bed, and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed." "I'll bet it's that giant skillywiggler I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "The what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me! It's all over my feet!" "It'll bite off your toes," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. There's the picture of that little scene. Delightful little scene. And here's Mrs. Twit after having been doused with cold water by her loving husband. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again. "By golly, it is a giant skillywiggler," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite off your nose." Mrs. Twit left out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. The wormy spaghetti. So gross. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch. I don't like where this is going. She cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving!" cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," said Mrs. Twit. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavor, but buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said.
And why it had a nasty bitter taste?
"Why?" he said.
Because it was worms!
Cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. The funny walking stick. He just looks diabolical in that picture. I'm just going to say it. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his woodshed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small. The next morning, Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by. But you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly, you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder.
"That stick's too long for you,"
Mr. Twit said to her one day.
"Why, so it is,"
Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick.
"I've a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right,"
Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself.
"What can have happened?"
Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick.
"It must suddenly have grown longer."
"Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow."
"Then what on earth has happened?"
cried Mrs. Twit.
"It's not the stick, it's you,"
said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly.
"It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now."
"That's not true,"
said Mrs. Twit.
"You're shrinking, woman,"
said Mr. Twit.
"It's not possible."
"Oh, yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days."
"Never!"
she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks, that's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks."
Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly, she had to sit down. I'm feeling a little bit sorry for Mrs. Twit. But we'll have to find out tomorrow how she's feeling. Hope you guys have a great night.